Here I was living another new life. I was up in the hills, overlooking a beautiful snow-filled valley far from any touch of civilization. This was my third winter since I disappeared. I'd better explain a bit. My name is John Martin. This time, my name has changed so many times that I almost forgot what my mother named me when I was born. I was the usual clueless spouse. My wife of 15 years had been in love with another man, Louis Amico, for longer than we had been married. She had married me to provide the things Louis couldn't, like a home, steady income, and a cover so she could continue to see him. He was already married to the local crime boss's daughter. The father-in-law didn't care if my wife's lover got some on the side, but Louis could never hurt his daughter. I found out about the affair when my daughters were injured in an auto accident. The hospital called me, informed me of the accident. They asked if I could donate one of my organs to help save my younger daughter's life. After the hospital tested me, they informed me that I couldn't donate. There was no tissue match. I wasn't related to my daughter. My other daughter was also injured in the accident and was not well enough to stand the stress of donation, so we needed to contact my wife. They tried to reach my wife, who was out of town at a 2-week-long conference. They found out that there was no conference, no hotel reservations, and her cell phone was turned off. My daughter Kim died that weekend. We were not able to find a donor fast enough. I had the necessary DNA tests done on my other daughter while she was in the hospital, and as I expected, she was not my child either. I shared this information with my daughter, Angie. She realized that her mother had lied to her for her entire life, and by doing so had caused her sister's death. She asked me to make sure that her mother never saw her again. She also asked if she could live with me. Let me back up a bit and tell you about my job. When I was in the Army, they discovered I had a knack for analyzing data. So I was assigned to the intelligence section of that branch of service. That was where my real abilities came to the surface. And with those abilities came a visit from the CIA. They offered me a contract job at Megabucks, with the requirement that I not tell anyone what I did. Well, I'd be a fool to pass the offer up, and I became a spook. They set it up that I was working for a front company and trained me how to hack into computers. I took to it like a duck to water. So here I was, 10 years later, one of the best in my field. My loving wife had no idea what I did for a living. All she knew was that I worked in an office and joint checking account never went dry. I called my CIA boss and explained about the accident, the DNA test results, my daughter's subsequent death, and that I needed to disappear or I'd kill my wife when she got home. I never realized how fast the CIA could work. 3 days later, my living daughter and I were on a private company jet heading west toward a new life. My old life was over. The bank accounts, credit cards, for 401k just disappeared. There was never an indication my daughter and I ever existed. One night, the home I had lived in and raised my family and also burnt to the ground. These guys eliminated everything. Too bad my cheating wife wasn't home when it burnt. I can just imagine the expression on my wife's face when she came home. Her cell phone wouldn't work, no one was at the airport to pick her up, and when she finally arrived home, all she found was what was left of the basement. She was left with exactly what she entered our marriage with, nothing. My daughter and I were given new identities, John and Julie Martin, and were settled on a ranch in Montana. The house was almost 3,000 square feet on 350 acres of some of the most beautiful land I had ever seen. The house was set up for me to continue my work for the CIA. They kept up the maintenance on it so I could continue with my work. My cover said I was a writer and needed the peace and quiet to write my novels. My cover also said I was very successful and had money to burn. My daughter enrolled at a state college and loved it. I missed her company, but my work kept me busy. Remember I said I was a very good computer hacker? Well, somehow all the financial records for Louis's father-in-law, the crime boss, started printing out on all the printers in the FBI's Organized Crime Division. The FBI now knew where to look and went right to work. 1 month later, all crime organizations' assets were seized. A bunch of people were arrested, and a divorce was started. That's right, a divorce between the son-in-law and his wife. It seems that she got a report of all her husband's little affairs over the years along with all his financial records. She even got all the hidden and offshore account numbers too. Her attorney had a field day. Louis's body was later found in a ditch. My wife was never seen again. I always wondered if she got away in time before the mob found her and took her life. My daughter never knew what happened to her mother, and she never asked. Her hatred for her mother ran that deep. My second winter on the ranch was a bear. I was snowed in for weeks at a time. One night I had the outside spotlights on to watch it snow when I noticed a movement at the edge of the light and started to watch it to see what it was. I was nervous that somehow somebody with revenge on their mind had found me. Well, you can imagine my surprise when it turned out to be a very large timber wolf. This guy must have weighed at least 150 pounds and stood 48-inch tall at the shoulders. He was big, but he looked as if he was in trouble. As I watched, I realized that he was in bad need of food. The hard winter was taking its toll on him. Yesterday, I had dragged a road-killed deer up to my barn to see if there was any meat I might salvage. I made a hasty decision to share the deer with him. He looked as if he needed it more than I did. I wasn't exactly stupid. I first turned every outside light that was controlled from the house on. Next, I grabbed one of my rifles and my .50 cal Desert Eagle pistol. I didn't want to be part of the wolf's next meal. I dragged the dead deer out from the barn and put it where I had last seen the wolf. I then went back into the house, turned off the lights, and went to bed. The next morning, the deer was gone. A couple of weeks later, he was back. This time, he wasn't pacing back and forth, but just sitting there watching my house. I had another deer in the meat locker that wasn't very tasty. It was old and tough. I thought, what the hell? I armed myself and went out to the meat locker and grabbed the venison. When I came out of the meat locker, there he was, just sitting about 20 feet from me, watching. With one hand on my gun, I relocked the meat locker and started dragging the deer away from the house. He walked with me out to the spot I had left the roadkill. He never got closer than about 20 feet to me and always kept the carcass between us. He wasn't aggressive toward me, nor did he appear afraid of me. It was more like two old friends talking a walk together. After I dropped the deer, I started backing away when he just barked at something behind me. I spun my head and found myself eyeball to eyeball with another wolf. The newcomer was standing dead, still looking at the other wolf. My friend started making wolf noises toward the newcomer. The newcomer suddenly backed away and circled to the large wolf's side. As I watched, I realized that the newcomer was a female and probably the mate of my alpha male. I did what any brave human would do when confronted by two wolves. I got the hell out of there. As I was backing up, I noticed that they didn't start eating, but working as a team, dragged the deer into the woods. I emailed my daughter at school later that day and explained about the wolf. I told her to call me before coming home so I could make sure the wolves were gone before she arrived. The wolf visited me a couple of more times that winter. While never really friendly, we reached an understanding. I let him have some meat when he visited, and he left me alone. When he was sitting outside my meat locker, he wanted a handout. He left me alone the rest of the time. In all fairness to him, he never came looking for handouts except when the weather was really bad and he couldn't hunt. And he never asked for more than he could carry. I was out walking one afternoon, just enjoying the spring air and all the wonders that happened every spring, when I saw my friendly wolf just watching me. I was a long way from the house, but I still had my Desert Eagle with me. He sort of greeted me in wolf talk, not aggressively, but almost friendly. Then he looked at me and started walking away. When I didn't follow, he came back and did the same ritual. After he did this a few times, the light went on. He wanted me to follow him. So off we went, him leading and me following. About 10 minutes into the woods, we stopped at a small clearing, and there was his mate feeding his young. There were two wolf pups with their mother. My alpha male walked over to her and nuzzled and licked her. It was as if he were showing me his family. I slowly sat on the ground and just watched. So this is what I was feeding all last winter. I was glad I helped them survive. Soon the pups were done nursing and started exploring their surroundings. One of them noticed me and wanted to explore what I was. I remembered the old saying, never get between a mother and her offspring. Let's just say I was more than a little nervous. I figured if I lived through this, I'd still need to change my underwear when I got home. Then the strangest thing happened. The alpha male came over to me, just lay down and put his head on my leg. The pup walked right over, climbed up on my leg, and went asleep. After a few minutes, I started scratching the pup's head very softly. His dad watched every move I made, but never interfered. An hour later, the pup awoke and walked back to his mother, but his dad just stayed with me. My alpha male put his head back down on my legs and closed his eyes. He trusted me. I was both honored and scared shitless. For the rest of the summer, I visited the little family and they visited me. I had new friends. It was my third year here when a really nasty January blizzard snowed us in. It started one afternoon and kept snowing for the next week. There was at least 4 feet on snow on the ground, and everything was shut down. The wind had made drifts on the road of over 8 feet high. My house is completely self-sufficient. I have generators for electric and ground oil tanks, propane tanks, satellite phones, and at least a month's food. So I wasn't worried about the storm. I was watching the storm out one of my windows. There's something about the fury of Mother Nature that just fascinated me. Then there was my friend, the alpha male, and he was upset. He was banging on my front door. He never came within 50 feet of the house before. He would walk out of the woods every once in a while. It always appeared as if he was checking on me from time to time. But this time it was different. He acted as if he needed me in a hurry. I went to my front door to open it to see if I could figure out what was bothering him. When I opened the door, he just walked in and pushed the door closed. You must realize that he had never come into my house. He was just too nervous around the house. The first thing he did was start carrying my coat, hat, and gloves to me. All the time he was barking at me as if to say hurry. So I quickly dressed and opened the door. I took my gun, just in case. We both went outside. He led me to the barn and just sat there expecting me to open the door. When I did, he grabbed my arm in his mouth and led me to my snowmobiles. He led me to the one machine that had the trailer attached. When I tried to unhitch the trailer, he wouldn't let me. While I was starting up the snowmobile, he pulled a couple of horse blankets to the trailer and put them in. I sat there and just watched in amazement. He then ran out in the yard and started his follow me dance. Something was very important to him, so I followed him. He led me across the fields toward the highway. He picked a path that was always big enough for the snowmobile and trailer. He knew exactly where he was going and wanted to make sure I got there too. Suddenly I saw where he was headed. There were 2 dark spots in the snow ahead. They looked like bodies. He ran right up to them and started barking and pulling at them. I pulled the snowmobile trailer up next to them. They were a couple of women. They were still alive, but just barely. I picked up the larger one and put her in the trailer. The other one was a smaller version. I assumed a daughter. I looked around and saw no sign of transportation to explain how they got here. The wolf climbed in the trailer with the women and wrapped his body around them as if trying to keep them warm. I climbed on the snowmobile and headed for home as fast as I could safely go. When we reached my front porch, I jumped off and opened the front door. I went straight to the gas fireplace and lit it and placed some of the couch pillows on the floor in front of it to put the women on. I brought both the women in and placed them in front of the fire. The wolf pulled my wall-hung bear skin rug off the wall and dragged it over to me while I was peeling the frozen clothing off the girls. After I got them wrapped in a couple of blankets and the rug, the wolf curled up next to them, both as their source of warmth and as their protector. I had never seen him act this way before. I grabbed my satellite phone and called my CIA contact. I explained the situation and asked for help. He responded that someone would be there in 30 minutes. True to his word, a large military helicopter landed in my yard 30 minutes later. There were some very large guys knocking at my door. I opened the door and grabbed the first one in a huge bear hug and whispered in his ear, "Don't make any fast moves." He thought I was nuts until he saw the wolf. I explained that this was the only way I could show the wolf that he was a friend. You should have seen the look on his face when the wolf stuck his nose in the man's rear and sniffed. But to his credit, he didn't flinch. I completed the same routine for the other 3 guys with him. Once the wolf was satisfied, he let the medics near the girls. The wolf was very nervous and the examinations went very slowly. It was determined that the women need to be in the hospital. The girls were loaded on the helicopter and off to a military hospital they were flown. The wolf watched them leave and then left me standing in the snow and cold. He appeared to be going back to his den. A few days later, some guys from another branch of the CIA paid me a visit. They explained the women were indeed mother and daughter. It seemed that the husband or father was a mob guy. He was caught trying to steal from his boss. He was killed in front of his wife and daughter. The wife and daughter were driven into the wilds and left to freeze to death. I was told that the girls were lucky I found them. I didn't explain to them about the wolf. It seemed that the government wanted them to stay with me until it could be determined if they were needed to provide court testimony. After that, they would be provided new IDs and put in witness protection. A couple of days later, my peace and quiet was again disturbed by a military helicopter. The two women and all their new belongings were soon set up in two of my spare bedrooms. After they got settled in, I called for a conference in my living room. After introductions, they started asking me questions. The daughter, Mandy, was your typical outspoken teenager. She asked all the questions and demanded all answers. Her mother, Maria, was quiet and shy. She did not initiate any conversation. She only responded when I directly asked her a question. She looked like a deer in the headlights before the car struck. Mandy asked all about the rescue. It seems there were rumors around the hospital, but she didn't believe any of them and wanted the truth. So I told the story of the blizzard, the wolf, the rescue, and of course she didn't believe me. To be exact, I believe bullshit was her answer. As I sat there trying to decide what to say next, I noticed their eyes got very large as they looked out my sliding glass door onto the deck. I knew the wolf decided to pick this time to make an appearance. I quickly told the women not to make any sudden movements or any loud noises. I explained that the wolf only wanted to make sure they were all right. After all, he had saved them that night and felt a little protective toward them. Actually, it was all bullshit. I didn't have any idea what he wanted, but I decided to go through the welcome routine for his benefit and the girl's safety. And let's face it, I liked hugging pretty women. Mandy accepted my hugs with grace and returned them back to me. Maria was scared. When I took her in my arms, she was shaking like a leaf. I spent a lot of time holding her and rubbing her back. I wanted her to calm down. I asked Mandy to slowly open the sliding glass door and let Alpha, my name for the wolf, in. And once she had the door open, to stand perfectly still so that the wolf was not panicked. She did what I asked. Her mother tightened her grip on me until I could have sworn she was trying to merge with me and become one individual. The wolf circled the statue called Mandy once, smelling her as he went around. I saw the fear in her eyes. I spoke softly to her and kept the panic from rising in her. When he was done, he walked over to Maria and me. I started whispering every calming thing I could think of, but she still fainted in my arms. I picked her up and moved her to the couch. After I got her down and covered, I looked at the wolf and pointed outside. He went out the door with his head hung down. Mandy commented, he looked embarrassed when he left, like he really didn't want to hurt Mom. Mandy and I sat with Maria for the next hour until she could get herself back under control. For the next couple of weeks, Maria stayed by my side every time she was out of her room. I felt as if she was using me as her protector. Every time we entered a room, her eyes quickly searched the area. I knew what she was looking for, but couldn't figure out a way to reduce her fear of the wolf. One spring afternoon, the three of us were sitting on my deck when I saw the wolf walk out of the woods and sit on my grass about 50 feet away. He just sat there and watched. Mandy noticed him right away, but her mother didn't. I reached over and took Maria's hand and pointed out on the lawn. She looked and spotted the wolf. My hand was suddenly caught in a death grip. I never knew she was that strong. The wolf suddenly stood and walked to the edge of the lawn where the woods started. He barked a couple of times and then returned to the spot where he had been sitting. After a couple of minutes, another wolf appeared and walked over to him. I recognized the second wolf as Alpha's mate. I identified her to the girls. Then, to my surprise, two smaller versions of the wolves appeared from the woods. They ran right over to the adult pair and curled up on my lawn. I looked at the girls and said, he's showing us his family. Do you want to meet them? Mandy said, yes. Maria kept quiet. I walked over to Mandy and took her hand, leading her to the edge of the deck and sitting down at the edge. Maria just stood at the entrance to the house, just hugging herself. Alpha slowly walked up on the deck and sat next to me. His mate soon followed and joined Mandy. The mate just curled up and put her head on Mandy's leg. I had to remind Mandy to close her mouth because she was catching flies. Our little family gathering lasted about an hour. The Alpha stood up and gave both Mandy and I a big wet lick on our faces and left with his family. Mandy and I went back into the house to find her mother. Maria was sitting in a chair with a view of the deck. She stood up when we entered and hugged both of us. She was still shaking when she said, "He really likes you too." I whispered in her ear, "He likes you too." I then kissed her forehead. I felt a little funny. It was a nice forehead. It had been years since I had felt those feelings toward another woman. When the weather warmed, I started taking evening walks with Maria and Mandy. Mandy loved the walks. We talked about nature, animals, and just about anything that entered her teenage head. Maria kept quiet during these walks, but she held my hand the entire time. It wasn't a romantic style hand-holding, but more of her holding onto her protector. During many of these walks, I noticed the alpha pacing up at a distance. He never approached when Maria was with us, but if it was just Mandy and I, he'd join us. The more time I spent with Alpha, the more impressed I was. I was raised with dogs, and even had an old English sheepdog for a pet when I was living back east. She was a great dog, smart as a tack and as gentle as could be. She was born deaf, so I never could let her run in the suburban neighborhood because of the fear of traffic. When she was about 1 year old, I enrolled her and I in obedience school. She took to the training as a duck to water. She learned the hand commands for deaf animals faster than I did. I still miss her. When she was about 15 years old, my ex got up one morning, called the vet, and had her put down. I was never consulted. I found my dog gone when I got home the evening. I never trusted my ex after that. The wolf was a lot smarter than any of the dogs I had ever seen. He was more like a friend than anything else I could think of. I was a little worried about Maria's mental health. She was just too withdrawn and quiet. I also worried about her fear of the wolf. No matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't crack the shell she had built around herself. I decided that it was time to get her professional help. I got on my satellite phone and started the ball rolling. About a week later, a car pulled in the driveway. A Mexican woman stepped out and introduced herself as Camelia, my new housekeeper and cook. Since I hadn't asked for a cook or housekeeper, I assumed she was the mental health professional. That proved to be the fact when we finally got a chance to talk privately. The next time I saw Alpha, I called Camelia over to start the introduction routine. Boy, was I surprised. When they saw each other, she dropped to her knees and held out her arms. My great big alpha wolf just about turned inside out. He was wiggling and making friendly wolf noises as he walked up to her, got between her arms, and they started licking and hugging. From that point on, they were the best of friends. Camelia started bonding with Maria and her daughter. I started feeling like a fifth wheel. There was nothing left for me to do but go back to my spook work. Camelia never left her cook or housekeeper persona, but I could see the difference in Maria in less than 2 weeks. And actually, I didn't mind. The quality of the meals around my house really improved. Julie, my daughter, was now a junior in college. She was all wound up with her friends and got a summer job on campus. She wouldn't be coming home this summer. I'd miss her, but I had Mandy to take her place. She still called and emailed every time she got a chance, but it still wasn't like she was here. She knew all about Maria and Mandy living with me. She felt that they were good for me. She also wanted to meet Mandy, just in case Mandy ended up being her stepsister. Fat chance, I told her, meaning the stepsister part, not the meeting part. One day after about a month of Camelia's stay, I noticed that she had Maria with her, and they had a bunch of meat scraps in a bowl. They were heading into the woods. Camelia saw me heading for them and shook her head. No, they were gone about the longest hour I had ever lived through. At dinner that night, Maria talked nonstop to her daughter, telling her story of feeding the wolf's babies. Camelia jabbed me very hard in the ribs every time I started to interrupt. That night after the house settled down, Camelia told me in no uncertain terms to let her do her job and to keep my mouth shut as far as any interactions between Maria and anyone else, including the wolf. Camelia said she was making great progress with both mother and daughter. Any interaction with me just set the healing process back. Boy, did I feel useless. Summer came to a close and Camelia felt that Mandy was secure enough in her new personality that I could enroll her in the local high school. So my niece and I drove the 40 miles into town to get her enrolled. Because my ranch was so far away and the winter roads were not the best, it was decided that Mandy would live at the school and come home on the weekends, weather permitting. She was the happiest sophomore you ever saw. To make matters even better, I took her shopping at the local mall. I kept my lips buttoned and let her purchase anything she wanted. $2,000 later, I was wondering if I was starting to regret it. I drive a Hummer H2. You should have seen how much stuff she packed in it. On the drive back to the ranch, she leaned across the seat and kissed me on the cheek. She said, "My real father never treated me as well as you do. I love you." My eyes filled up. It was the best money I could have spent. As it turned out, when I explained it to Camellia, all I got was a big hug and kiss. All she said was, "One down and one to go." I guess I did well. Fall started and school began. Camellia worked very hard on Maria and finally got her to agree to go with me one Friday to pick up Mandy from school. Maria was very quiet for the hour it took us to get there. Mandy was waiting for us outside her dorm. She grabbed her mom and pulled her in to show her mom her room. No guys allow, so I just sat in the truck. About 30 minutes went by when mother and daughter popped out the door dragging a very full laundry bag between them. Now I knew what my own mother felt when I came home for a visit from college. For the next hour, Mandy took her mother and I around the school, showing us all the great stuff that was there. Maria was smiling from ear to ear the entire time. On the way back, we stopped at a local diner to grab a bite to eat. We sat in a booth. Mandy was across from Maria and me. Mandy never shut up while we were there. Maria sat next to me, touching my arm, my hand, and even my leg the entire time we were there. For the first time since I had met her, she wasn't hanging on to me as if I was her protector, but as her friend. When we got back to the ranch, Camellia shooed me out of the kitchen to do the chores and sat down with coffee to talk to the girls. Later that evening, Camellia patted me on the butt and said, "Good job." We had a great weekend, and the ride back Sunday night was as upbeat as possible. Maria and Mandy made all sorts of plans for the next weekend. On the way back to the ranch, Maria talked my ear off. She laughed and smiled, and even held my hand all the way back. Camellia couldn't have been happier when I told her that night. During the week, Maria asked me to take a walk with her while we were having lunch. A quick glance at Camellia revealed she had heard the whole thing and couldn't have been happier. Maria and I walked and talked. Actually, she talked and I listened. We held hands like a couple of teenagers. Toward the end of our walk, I spotted Alpha. I pulled her to the side of me that was the farthest for him. When she realized what I was doing, she told me to stop. She and Alpha were friends now, and she owed him for saving her life. With that said, she dropped to her knees and spread her arms to him. I couldn't believe it. Alpha came up to her exactly like he did so long ago to Camellia. This time they played like a couple of puppies. I admitted I was jealous, except I wasn't sure if it was of her affection for the wolf or the wolf's affection for her. I was going to need to talk to Camellia about my feelings tonight. The three of us walked back to the house together, Maria between the wolf and I. She held my hand and the wolf's ear. She was as calm as I ever saw her. Camellia was watching from the deck and grinning from ear to ear when we got back. That night, Camellia told me that her work here was just about done. She was going to make a pretend trip to visit her relatives for a long weekend. She wanted me to assess Maria's actions while she was gone. There was one word of warning. You need to let Maria make every decision. Make none of them for her. Camellia announced her little trip at dinner the next day. Maria went to bed early that night. She was back to her old quiet self. I don't know what went on, but Camellia and Maria were joined at the hip all week. By Friday, Camellia winked at me and whispered, "Here goes nothing." She announced at breakfast that she'd be riding into town with Maria and me to catch the bus to her relatives. Camellia had it all mapped out. We first picked up Mandy at school and then dropped Camellia at the bus station. Maria had no downtime. Camellia kept her talking the whole trip into town, and Mandy talked the entire way back to the ranch. When we got back to the ranch, Maria was all wound up. It was like she never had a chance to let her feelings down. The next morning was her first day on her own. When she asked Mandy and I what we wanted for breakfast, we both replied it was her choice. I saw a bit of panic in her eyes. It was the first decision she had to make in a long time. She walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a typed list. After looking at it a minute, she said we'd be having ham and cheese omelets. Mandy looked at me and said it sounded good to both of us. I hated ham and cheese omelets, but I just smiled and agreed. Later that night, I looked at the list. It contained lists of meals. The omelet was about halfway down the breakfast selections. The three of us had a very busy weekend. Maria wasn't given a chance to let down. Camellia had briefed Maria's daughter very well. Mandy kept her mother running all weekend long. We were supposed to pick up Camelia at the bus station when we dropped Mandy off at school. My cell phone rang as we were headed into town. It was Camelia needing extra time at her relatives. I gave the call to Maria. Maria and Camelia talked until I thought the battery on the phone might give out. Camelia worked her magic and Maria was in a better mood when they hung up. Maria and I stopped at the same diner we always did and had dinner. We sat in a booth. She sat next to me instead of across from me. She had a little trouble deciding what to eat. She picked the first dinner item on the menu. When we arrived back at the ranch, she went to her room. She did not return downstairs that night. The next morning I awoke to the smell of bacon. When I got downstairs I found she had made pancakes and bacon for breakfast. I complimented her on the great choice. She beamed. And so it began. Maria was rejoining the human race. She was back to becoming a productive member. One afternoon, I sat her in front of one of my PCs and showed her one of my stories. I said I needed her opinion on how my story was going because my editor was on vacation and needed a second opinion. I said, "I trust and respect your judgment. Please read and comment on this for me." "I'd love to," was her reply. After explaining how the word processor worked, I left her alone. Maria stayed glued to the story for the next 6 hours. When she finally came out of my office, she was grinning from ear to ear. "I loved it," she said. And with that she gave me a very tentative little kiss and left to start dinner. After she went to bed that night, I fired up the PC and checked her editing. There were the usual spelling and punctuation corrections. They were interspersed with some very insightful suggestions and comments. I knew at that point she had recovered and I would soon be losing her company. My friends at the CIA would be moving her and her daughter into witness protection. I knew I would miss them when the time arrived. Later that week, a really nasty thunderstorm came through in the middle of the night. One lightning strike took out a tree on the side yard. I got up to inspect the house for any damage. When I got back to my room, I found Maria cowering in a corner. She was crying from fright. I took her in my arms and led her to my bed. We climbed in together and just cuddled. Soon she stopped crying and went asleep. I held her the rest of the night. As much as I didn't want to, I was the perfect gentleman. I finally fell asleep around dawn. I awoke to the smell of bacon. I opened my eyes and saw Maria standing there with a bed tray and breakfast on it. She smiled as she said, "Please sit up. I made up breakfast in bed for us." We sat side by side and ate in silence. After finishing, she put her head on my shoulder. "Thank you. You are the first man I ever slept with who didn't try to have sex with me. My husband used to share me with his mob friends to keep them happy," she confessed. She broke down and sobbed her heart out. I spent the next hour just holding her. Toward the end, I told her I'd never let anyone use or hurt her again. She hugged me even closer and said, "Thank you." She punctuated that with a kiss with more feeling in it than I have ever felt before. I knew I'd need to telephone Camelia tonight. I needed direction. My own feelings were just too confused to trust my judgment. Maria and I spent the rest of the day together. We were like a couple of teenagers experiencing puppy love for the first time. We washed and dried the dishes from breakfast. We did the laundry. We made the beds. And we cooked dinner. All these things were done together, never more than a foot or so away from each other. I don't know about Maria, but the time with her rated right up with the birth of my daughters as one of the happiest times of my life. The worst time of my life occurred that night when I called Camelia. I got hell. Camelia yelled at me that I was messing Maria up big time and to keep myself away from her. Camelia said she would be calling Maria in the morning to try and repair the damage I'd done. The next day when I returned from my outside chores, Maria said that Camelia had called and we needed to pick her up at bus station at 6 p.m. Maria was very happy to soon be seeing her friend. I, on the other hand, wasn't. At 6 o'clock, we were outside the bus station. Camelia jumped off the bus, hugging both Maria and myself, demanding to be fed because she was starved. All through dinner at the diner and all the way home, Camelia and Maria sat together in the rear seat and talked very softly among themselves. I could not hear what was being said, but I suspected I was the subject of the conversation. When we reached home, the only thing I was asked was to bring Camelia's bags to her room. The next morning at breakfast, I felt that I was being ignored. Maybe I felt that way because neither of them said a word to me. They disappeared into Camelia's room until dinner that night. As we sat around the table, Maria dropped the bomb. "I'm leaving with Camelia in the morning. Would you take care of Mandy until I'm well enough to take over? I know she loves you like a father, and I feel you can be trusted with her." I started to protest, but a look from Camelia stopped me. I said, "Of course. I love her like my own daughter. She can stay as long as she wants." My heart being torn from my chest as I agreed. Later that night, Camelia visited me in my room after I had gone to bed. We had a long talk. We discussed my feelings toward Maria and her feelings toward me. Camelia explained that Maria had a long way to go before she was able to maintain a real relationship. Camelia explained that Maria had never disclosed being shared sexually before. That revelation, while it was an important event, required a different course of therapy. Everything Camelia discussed with me made sense, but it didn't heal my heartbreak. On the way out my bedroom door, Camelia said, "Call me anytime and we'll talk. I know this is breaking your heart." How'd she know? I thought. When I picked up Mandy from school that Friday afternoon, I had a lot of questions to answer. Maria had called Mandy and said she was leaving with Camelia and I'd be picking Mandy up, but no further explanation was given. So I had a lot to explain. Mandy and I talked all through dinner at the diner and on the rest of the ride home. I started out by telling Camelia was a doctor, not a housekeeper. She was hired to help Maria with her mental health issues. We discussed how well her mother had become since I hired Camelia and how much she was drawn to her mother. Mandy also exclaimed, "No wonder Camelia was so easy to talk to. I wonder if I can still discuss girl things with her?" I gave her Camelia's phone number and exclaimed, "Of course, she loves you like a daughter." I made a mental note to warn Camelia that there might be some phone calls coming. The rest of the weekend went pretty good, except when I found Mandy standing in my office. "There's too much computing power here for just a writer. What do you really do? You have too much money." When Mom and I were in the hospital, it was a military hospital. We were even transported back here by military helicopter. And then there's that funny phone you have locked up in your desk. Oh shit. I thought, how much do I tell her? I looked her right in the eyes and said, "This goes nowhere further. I work for the CIA. I'm not a writer." The writer part is just to explain why I live isolated in the hills. Her eyes got very round as I talked. She finally asked, "If I talked about you, what would happen?" "I'd probably be killed," I answered. She started crying. "I guess I'd better keep my mouth shut. You are too important a person to me to risk losing." We had a very big hug. I remembered that my long-dead daughter would be about her age now if she had lived. Someday, I'd need to have a discussion with her about Kim. All Mandy knew is that I had one daughter from a previous marriage living on campus. While Mandy and Julie were friends, Julie didn't come home except for major holidays, so Mandy and Julie ever had the opportunity to bond. Kim was never mentioned. I'd need to change that if we were going to be a family. Thanksgiving was right around the corner. I thought a nice family dinner would be in order. I sent Julie an email to attend and bring any friends she wanted. I also offered to drive over and pick them up and then give her a new car to drive back to campus with or drive her back to college in my H2. You'll never guess which option she picked. As the time to pick them up approached, Mandy and I had a few more heart-to-heart talks. I discussed Kim and her dying. I explained that my ex-wife had cheated on me with a lover. Kim and Julie were the result of that cheating. I explained, Kim and Julie were in an automobile accident. Kim needed a kidney transplant and a piece of a liver to survive. When I was tested for the transplant, it was determined that I wasn't Kim's father and couldn't donate, and Julie was too injured. We tried to contact her mother, but we were not able to find her. Kim died later that day. I whispered. I then told her about how my bosses at the CIA moved Julie and me out here, and that they also arranged to bury Kim's body out here on a hillside overlooking the creek. Mandy asked if I could walk her out there and introduce her to her sister, Kim Soon. I really don't remember what happened next, but I do remember crying on Mandy's shoulder and her holding me saying, "It's all right, Daddy. I'll always be here to help." I remembered thinking, I'll need to explain to her that I need to marry her mother before she can call me Daddy. But right now, I'll accept the promotion anyway. Mandy and I loaded the Hummer and took off to pick up Julie and two of her friends. It was almost a day's drive, so we were going to spend the night in a motel before starting on our return trip. As it turned out, I spent the night in the motel. Mandy spent the night in the dorm with her sister and the other girls. Boy, did I get some funny looks when Mandy called Julie her sister. I gave Julie the "I'll explain later" look. She returned the "damn right you will" look. There were just too many women in my life. That night, after getting everyone in their beds, Julie and I had a long talk. All I got in return was, "Thanks for explaining, Dad." At breakfast, I overheard Julie calling Mandy sis. They had started accepting each other. I choked up a little. Later that day, Camelia and Maria pulled up in front of the house. After being introduced to everyone, the four of them took a walk together. As I watched them walk away, I realized they were headed in the general direction of Kim's resting place. I grabbed my pistol and followed them up the hill. By the time I arrived at the grave site, they were introducing themselves to Kim. Watching them brought back very painful memories for me. I sat down on the ground behind them and started crying softly. I don't know how long I was sitting there when I felt something by my side. Alpha had joined me. He was sitting on the ground next to me watching everyone at the grave site. A few minutes later, his mate joined Alpha and I on the other side of me. She licked my face and then curled up next to me. It was like being joined by two old friends. I put my arms around each of them. After the kids finished telling Kim about themselves, they turned toward me to head back to the house. It was then they saw Alpha, his mate, and me sitting in the grass watching them. Mandy and Julie walked right up to Alpha and started hugging them and scratching behind their ears. Camelia, Maria, and the other two girls were a little more reserved. They realized that these were very dangerous animals, but somehow knew they wouldn't be hurt by them. While everyone waited, I had a private chat with my daughter, Kim. "I miss you, baby. I hope you liked meeting your new sister." As a group, we all walked back to the house. When we arrived, the girls went in. The wolves and I walked over to the meat locker. I gave them each a piece of their favorite cuts of venison. It was a very somber group I found sitting in the family room. I always remembered Kim as a happy child. She was always smiling and making jokes. So I sat down with the group and started talking about all the good times I could remember with Kim. It took me almost an hour, but I had them all smiling again. Later that evening, Camelia took me by the arm and whispered, "I'm going to have to watch you. I feel you're after my job." As she walked away, she gave me a little pat on the behind and smiled. I blushed. She cracked up. The rest of the weekend went off without a hitch. When it was time for Julie to leave, I sprang my surprise on her. I opened one of the barn doors and backed out her new Toyota RAV4. The SUV provided her good fuel mileage, dependability, and most importantly, from a father's point of view, safety. Mandy had helped me pick it out. She chose the color, interior, and accessories. Mandy's choices were exactly what Julie would have picked herself. And Julie said so by giving her sister a great big hug. The girls packed up the RAV4 for the trip back to college, but not before promising to exchange email and phone calls as often as possible. Maria and Camelia soon left also. But before they left, Maria and Camelia both hugged Mandy and made her promise to keep them updated of anything going on in her life. Maria walked over to me and said, "Thank you for making my daughter a part of your family." Then she gave me a kiss. From the car as Maria got in, I spotted Camelia grinning from ear to ear. That woman's up to something again, I thought. I spoke to my CIA boss a few days later and got permission to track down the killers of Mandy's father. I felt a little revenge was in order, first for leaving Mandy without a father, no matter how bad he ended up being. And second, I suspected the bad guys forced him to allow them to use Maria. That's how they operated. My CIA handlers had a file delivered to me about the cartel's operation. I started my revenge later that day. It took about 2 months, but by then I had broken into all their data stores and started transferring their money around. The transfers were designed to look as if each member of the cartel was stealing from others in the cartel. After I had them suspecting each other, I started making public the names of everyone they were currently bribing. The network fell apart. Some members of the cartel were arrested, some killed, and others just disappeared. That drug cartel no longer existed. I had my revenge, and Maria was no longer living under their death threat. Christmas was rapidly approaching, and this year it looked as if I'd be alone. Julie and Mandy were going to spend the holidays with one of Julie's friends' family. I was not invited. Camelia felt it was too risky to let Maria visit me. I guess I'd just spend it with Alpha and his family. At least I wouldn't need to bring a plate to pass. As the holiday approached, I sunk deeper into a blue funk. I was awakened Christmas morning by a very loud helicopter landing in my yard. A man in a black flight suit knocked at my door and explained, "You are wanted at Langley, sir. Please follow me." We first went to an Army airstrip and I was escorted to an Air Force jet. The jet was a long-range fighter. I was given a helmet and strapped in. The pilot explained as we were taxiing onto the runway, "We'll be flying between 60,000 and 70,000 feet at just under Mach 1. Our total travel time should be just over 2 hours." I started to say, "Okay," when he kicked in the bum. I was slammed into the seat and couldn't move until he leveled off at 60,000 feet. I looked at the back of his helmet as he said, "How'd you like that, sir?" I was a writer, so I expressed myself in the most elegant terms I could. "Holy shit," I said. "That about covers it, sir," was his reply with a smile in his voice. Now, military jets don't have in-flight movies, so I bugged the pilot about all the knobs and buttons in front of me. Most of the time, he just kept yelling, "Don't touch that, you'll kill both of us." I could take a hint, so I closed my eyes and tried to doze off. I must have succeeded because I awoke to the pilot talking to the ground controller asking permission to land. After a bunch of chatter, permission was granted and I felt us heading down. The actual landing was perfect. I barely felt a thing. We were directed to a hangar and a black SUV pulled up to the plane. My CIA boss got out of the rear door. I guess it must be really important if he was out here. The ground crew opened up the jet's canopy and helped me out. When my feet hit the ground, I turned around. There on either side of my boss were Camelia and my Maria. They were grinning from ear to ear. My boss explained that these two beautiful women just couldn't bear the thought of spending Christmas without me. "So get your bum in the SUV. You all are invited to join my wife and myself for dinner." It was the best Christmas ever. Maria and I were glued to each other all day. One time when I came out from using the bathroom, I found Maria waiting outside the door for me. "You were gone so long, I really missed you, so I thought I'd wait out here for you," she said with a silly grin. Camelia watched Maria and me like a hawk all day. Since she was smiling, I guessed I was doing okay. We were all sitting around in the family room just discussing stuff when I guess I fell asleep. I woke to quiet and the loving touch of Maria's hand on the side of my face. I just stayed still, pretending to be asleep, and enjoyed the feeling of her hand. "I know you're awake, so open your eyes and look at me," she whispered. When I opened my eyes, I was just in time to catch her bending over to kiss me. And what a kiss it was. She said, "Camelia and I are leaving now, and you are being taken to your quarters. Please see me tomorrow if you can. I want to hold you one more time before you leave." We walked hand in hand into the kitchen where our rides were waiting. My boss said, "We'll talk tomorrow. Some people want to meet you." Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, Camelia walked into my room. For the next hour, she updated me on Maria's progress. What it all boiled down to was Maria was almost ready to join the real world. My job was to help her without taking advantage of her trust. All I want to do is make love to her, and Camelia keeps making me promise to be good. Life's not fair, I thought. The next day, I was picked up and driven to the CIA headquarters at Langley and taken to my boss's office. He showed me around and introduced me to the guys. I guess I was a hero of sorts. My work was really respected by everyone I met. When the day wound down, I asked if I could see Maria again before I left. "They had to leave," was all the answer I got. Little did I know how long it would be before I saw them again. The Air Force returned me and I got back to my life. Julie's graduation came and went. Mandy and I cheered our heads off from the stands. Maria never attended. Mandy graduated from high school. She gave the commencement speech. Julia and I cheered our heads off. Maria never attended. Mandy went to the same college Julie graduated from. She wanted to attend that school because her sister, Julie, would be there doing graduate work, and they were close. The girls spent every major holiday with me. Maria never did. To be exact, we never heard from Maria. No phone calls, emails, or letters in all those years. I even tried calling Camelia. I was told she was reassigned. I called my boss about Maria. He never returned my call. I was told in no uncertain terms that Maria wanted no further contact with me, Mandy, or Julie. She wanted out of our lives. I told the girls. We all had a good cry. The years rolled past, and one day I found myself walking down the aisle as the father of the brides. That's right, I said brides. The girls planned a double wedding. Everything went off without a hitch. I could have been happier, but she didn't attend even after we sent her an invitation. About a year later, my boss drove up the driveway followed by a convoy of SUVs. He took me into the house and sat me down. He handed me a piece of paper and said, "I'm sorry." I opened it and started to read. It was Maria's last will and testament. I looked at him, my eyes starting to tear. "She's gone," he said. "She went in her sleep with no pain. It was a very slow form of cancer. Every time we thought the cancer was in remission, it started up in another spot. She didn't want you or the girls to see her die that way. You know she loved you all very much." She asked and was given pictures, videos, and reports on all the important events in your lives. He volunteered. "And every night she slept in one of your old shirts. She wouldn't let Camellia or I ever replace it even though it wasn't more than a rag. She loved you that much. One more thing," he said. "She asked to be buried next to your daughter Kim. She said that although she never met Kim, Kim was her daughter too. It's all in her will." He then looked at his watch and said, "Let's go. They should have her grave ready by now." I really don't remember much of the service. I was just too broken up. The last thing I remember is my boss informing me that he'd tell the girls and make sure someone was there to stay with me before leaving me at the gravesite. After they all left, Alpha came out of the woods and sat with me. He howled and I cried all night. In the morning, Alpha pushed and prodded me until I walked back to the house. Camellia was there waiting for me. She helped me shower and put me to bed. I awoke the next day in Camelia's arms. We made tender love. We slept, made love, and cried all the next night. We only got out of bed to use the bathroom and eat. We each mourned Maria in our own special way, because Maria had meant so much to each of us. The girls each called the next day. They were coming home next weekend to say goodbye to their mother. Alpha died the next year. I buried him next to my two loves to protect them until I could join them. I am in my late 70s now and I'm tired. I dropped my boss's replacement an email, my boss having retired years ago. In the email, I explained what I wanted. I wanted to be buried with my family on that hillside. I had the headstone made and the hole dug. I asked him to see that my wishes were kept. I then emailed Julie and Mandy. I told them both goodbye since I was going to join Maria and Kim. I walked up the hill with my trusty Desert Eagle and lay down. When I heard the first helicopter approaching, I put the gun in my mouth. Soon I wouldn't be lonely anymore. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.